Quick mic check. Can everybody hear us back again? Okay. Okay, we're good. Well, welcome to the second half. We have Professor Daniel Rueckert. He is an Alexander I Humboldt Professor for AI in Medicine and Healthcare at the Klinikum Rueckert at the Technical University of Munich. And he is also the director of the Institute for AI and Informatics in Medicine. Additionally, he's a professor of visual information processing in the Department of Computing at Imperial College London. In 2024, he received the Mackay Enduring Impact Award for his outsized contributions to medical image computing. As well, he's also a recipient of the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize awarded by the German Research Foundation. Today, he will be talking on multimodal AI and the future of radiology. Take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a difficult task following up after so many great talks in the first half. So I'll try to give you an overview of some of the work we've been doing in our group on, especially on multimodal AI, because I think that's sort of also the title of the workshop, and how I think it might shape the future of radiology. And I think many of you have seen these different newspaper headlines of how AI is going to shape the future of medicine. You see here some international newspapers as well as some German newspapers. You also probably have seen some predictions from relatively famous people. Most of you will know this person. Most of you will also know the prediction from Jeff Hinton in 2016. Which basically says radiologists will be obsolete in 5 years' time. And if you look at the reality of what's happening, it's unfortunately pretty much like this. And I think you have also heard in the previous talk, perhaps what are the reasons why AI hasn't really taken off, perhaps in the same way as it has actually capabilities. And of course, if you sort of talk to somebody like myself, I very much come from the field of AI in radiology, in medical imaging. That's where sort of I grew up. And it's also perhaps the one field in medicine where the AI is most advanced. If you look at, for example, FDA statistics, how many FDA approved AI tools there are, you see that the vast majority is in radiology. I think actually, by the way, that probably also includes pathology. So radiology, pathology really are the leaders in that field. And I think the reason for that is also due to the fact that if you look at the typical imaging pipeline which you have in radiology, there are numerous different opportunities for AI to really be inserted in that. And I think when we look at our papers, quite often sort of the sexiest way of selling this is we're going to improve the diagnosis and the prognosis of diseases with AI. But that's perhaps also the most difficult one to make money with or to actually get into a clinical workflow. If you look at the opposite side of this, or at the bottom part of this pyramid, image acquisition, image reconstruction, that's dominated by now through AI. And as far as I can see, it's probably the only application of AI which is used every day in clinical practice. If you buy a modern MR scanner from Siemens, from GE, from Philips, all of them going to use some way of doing AI-based image reconstruction. And the real reason why this is so successful is because it doesn't really change the workflow, correct? The clinician doesn't even see that the image is generated with AI because the clinician is going to do the same thing as before. So this is perhaps a quite good reason for why AI is so successful in radiology. Now, I want to start off by talking about some large data sets. You have already seen in the previous talks, it's very impressive how many data sets are now released in typically clinical data sets, which are open sourced and which you can download. One data set which our group is using quite heavily is data from something called the UK Biobank, which is a population study. So it's not a study of patients in a hospital, but it's a cross-sectional study of a largely healthy population where you have whole body MRI imaging. You also have dedicated brain imaging, dedicated cardiovascular imaging. And you have that from over 100,000 subjects. So it's a very sort of powerful, large data set. It's open source in the sense that you can apply for the data, you can download the data with the right credentials, and it's really very well curated. In addition to that, you have also in UK Biobank a bigger superset of 500,000 subjects from which you have a lot of lifestyle, physical activity information. A large part of this data set, for example, has variable information. You have whole genome and whole exome sequencing, and you also have a link to their clinical records because the UK operates a National Health Service, which is a national health service. All of these healthcare data is unified in one data system and accessible for research purposes. So this is a pretty unique data set, which you can actually do very interesting things with. One of the things we started doing is, of course, a while ago, when we started developing tools for analyzing the images, we're still very much doing sort of standard image based algorithms which use AI, for example, for image segmentation, which can, for example, try to extract phenotypes from these images in a fully automated fashion. Here, for example, see how we can automatically track the heart in cardiovascular MRI images. We can automatically quantify the volumes, the motion patterns of the heart, and so on. And one of the things you can do with this type of data, because you have such a large cohort of subjects from which you have that data, you can, for example, define normative values which were previously not so well established, for example, as a function of age or as a function of sex. And what you see here, for example, is how some of these cardiovascular image-derived phenotypes change with age and with sex. And you see, for example, that many of these phenotypes stay relatively constant across age. But if you look at, for example, aortic distensibility or elasticity of vessels, you can see how much that's declining as you're aging. One of the things you can do with that as well is you can sort of identify correlations or associations between what you see in imaging and what is, for example, a lifestyle or physical activity of that patient. And here you see, for example, these associations studied in a similar way as you, for example, do genome-wide association studies, where you effectively take your image-derived phenotypes and you correlate them to every single measurement you have in UK Biobank. And that gives you a plot like this, and you can sort of then look at the strength of these correlations. Now, I should point out, it's quite important to realize that these are correlations, they're not causations. And this is still something very useful to identify new hypotheses. For example, if you want to identify whether there are some correlates between certain diseases and of course, these image-derived phenotypes. What we've done more recently with this type of data is to identify, can we also do risk prediction for these patients? Now, you have to realize that these patients are largely healthy. In this sense, the term patient is probably actually the wrong term. These are subjects, and you can sort of, for example, look at their risk at getting certain diseases, for example, cardiovascular disease, liver disease, pancreatic disease, or, for example, osteoarthritis. And what you can do is, because you have these patients typically at a point when they're still healthy, you can now define, for example, a window, let's say a 3-year or 5-year window, in which you would like to identify whether they're at risk at developing any of these diseases. And so we have studied, for example, how much is imaging adding to all the other, for example, risk models which are based on non-imaging information. Of course, if you know that somebody is smoking, then they have much higher risk of developing lung disease. But of course, what's interesting is how much more information you get from having the imaging information as well, and not only the tabular information. So what we have done in this paper, which is just published now in Nature Communications, is to sort of take different combinations of imaging information and tabular information and studying how well they predict different types of diseases. And what you see in some cases, of course, many of these diseases are not visible in the type of imaging data we have in UK Biobank. But for other diseases, it's very clear, for example, that imaging adds a lot of information in terms of trying to do risk prediction and identify risk early on for these patients. So there's clearly a benefit in including imaging in many of these risk prediction models. One of the other things which we've been trying to sort of start to work on is towards developing foundation models from data coming from UK Biobank. And as I said before, one of the attractive elements of that it's typically healthy data, and you can identify disease in terms of identifying outliers from this healthy norm. Now, if you look, for example, at cardiovascular imaging, if you are familiar with how cardiovascular imaging is typically acquired, it's typically acquired not as a volume data, but typically multiple slices. For example, short axis views as well as long axis views. And what you would like to do is you would like to build a unified representation of this quite distinct set of different views of the cardiovascular system. So you can then solve different downstream tasks. For example, segmentation tasks, identifying phenotypes, as well as, for example, studying motion in the heart. And for that, you need a unified model which can do all of these different tasks. And this is something which we have tried to build in this paper here, which was published last year at MICAIN, which I want to sort of very briefly walk you through what the key components of this method are. So the first thing what we do is sort of we try to view this as many papers have already shown and many speakers already this morning showed as a sort of representation learning problem. Can we try to derive a representation from our different imaging data, which we can then use for lots of different downstream tasks? And what we do here is we use an image transformer-based approach, which is trained using a sort of masked imaging approach, where we have a self-supervised learning paradigm for learning an encoder and a decoder, and training that in a self-supervised fashion. And sort of this approach is relatively straightforward. You have this encoder module, you have a decoder module, and you train this as a reconstruction task. And of course, you have to use a relatively large amount of data to train that with. This is trained with over 10,000 subjects, for which we sort of identified them as really healthy subjects. But if you look at the imaging data, that's probably around 1 million 2D MR slices, which you have available for all these data set patients. Now, once you have this model, you have sort of learned a representation space, which you can visualize in lots of different forms. You can now try to solve the downstream tasks by effectively developing different decoder modules. For example, one decoder module might, for example, predict phenotypes. Another decoder module tries to do segmentation, or another one is, for example, solving tasks such as motion tracking. Now, if you, for example, have a prediction decoder, that prediction decoder can, for example, directly from the imaging data predict phenotypes which you see in the images. For example, your left ventricular mass or left ventricular stroke volume is something you can directly predict from this representation without really having to perform a segmentation. Here you see different of these phenotypes color-coded on the embedding, which is learned from this approach in 2D. And you can sort of see that there's a very clear clustering of subjects which have very similar phenotypes are clustered very close together in that representation space. But you can also use this, this representation space to then sort of decode it into a segmentation. And that's very useful because that's probably the way we achieve explainability with, because you can show this segmentation to a clinician and they can visually check that this representation actually makes sense and has captured the phenotypes which you have learned correctly. Now, one of the things you can also do with this type of approach is, of course, and I think Akshay was already showing this early on, you can also, of course, couple this also with non-imaging information. And this is an approach which was presented by one of our PhD students 2 years ago here at CVPR, where you effectively use a very similar approach to what Akshay showed you with images and text. Here you're combining imaging and tabular information to learn two embeddings, which are then aligned in a sort of clip style fashion. And you can sort of use this additional information which you get from your tabular features to actually build a much stronger representation than if you're only using that learned from images alone. And so there are lots of technical details in how you might best encode your information in such a type of scenario, which I will skip in the interest of time, but I think I've seen Paul somewhere sitting in the back here. So if you have any questions about how this works in detail, feel free to reach out to him. Now, one of the things you can, of course, then also do is sort of to combine that completely with this foundation model, which I showed you earlier on, where you now really have a representation which is really empowered by these different imaging sequences which you have available in UK Biobank and the different phenotypes which you can extract from these images. And that gives you a very strong representation, which you, if you then use to, for example, predict clinical information from or clinical phenotypes from, is a very powerful approach. So you can sort of combine here in that setting very nicely imaging and non-imaging information. But of course, we also have in many cardiovascular diseases, not only imaging and tabular information, but also, for example, data which comes from sources such as ECG information. So if you look at, for example, the first line of diagnosis of cardiovascular disease is typically not imaging. Imaging, and in particular forms such as MR imaging, they're quite expensive, they have limited availability, but they provide very rich diagnostic information. But the first line of defense is typically, if you go to your general practitioner's setting, they will do an ECG with the patient as a first measure to study what might be wrong with the patient. And one of the ideas is, can we actually also combine in a similar form ECG information and imaging information so that we might actually enrich our ECG signal with information which is normally only available in the imaging? So for that approach, we use an approach where we first pre-train an ECG only a model where we effectively take a large number of ECG signals and we try to sort of pre-train this on performing relatively simple classification tasks. But and it turns out that actually if you do that, it's very hard to predict some more sophisticated or more complicated elements of cardiovascular disease. So these ECG features on their own, if you only train a model like this, will typically not perform nearly as well as, for example, models which are trained with imaging information. So we're using, nevertheless, in this approach, a very similar setup to what I've shown you with an imaging scenario. It's effectively a masked modeling approach where we pre-train our signal encoder. But what we're also going to do is we're going to enrich this signal encoder with information coming from MR imaging. So for example, in UK Biobank, you have paired data for each of the subjects for which you have imaging information. You also have ECG information. So what you can now do in a sort of second stage, do a truly multimodal contrastive learning approach, where you do a sort of clip-based approach to align embeddings learned from ECG and embeddings learned from cardiovascular MR imaging. And of course, this sort of clip alignment, I think you have seen now in many cases with, for example, text and images. Here we're simply doing the same thing with the ECG signal and the image information in order to align these two different models. Now, once you have done that, you can, of course, now try to sort of do a fine-tuning or inference using the ECG information only. So the idea here is really that you have now a better representation of your features in the ECG information, in the ECG signal, that they might be able to help you with solving downstream tasks, which you cannot normally solve if you don't have this multimodal learning-based approach. But what I wanted to highlight here in this scenario, you have at inference time only the ECG signal available. You don't have the imaging information available at inference time. And it turns out that if you do that, you can, for example, predict some of the structural parameters in the heart. So, for example, information such as morphological features of the heart, LV volume, and so on, from the ECG, which seems quite surprising because, of course, the ECG measures electrical activity, and information such as morphological features in the heart, they're very deeply hidden in this ECG signal. So it's quite surprising that this actually does work as well as it seems to work. Now I want to switch gears a bit and sort of also now come to talk a bit about language models, because we have seen that, of course, a lot of information about multimodal data can be encoded in terms of language models. And you've also seen a lot of papers which have demonstrated how well language models do in performing tasks which seemingly are tasks which doctors perform every day. But it's probably also worthwhile, and I think we saw some nice examples early on, that some of these benchmark tests which people have used to test large language models are somewhat a bit misleading. If you look at, for example, a lot of sort of these medical licensing exams, which were used early on to evaluate how good does a language model perform in solving clinical tasks. Well, first of all, you have to sort of look at, if you look at these US medical licensing exam, I think the passing threshold is something around 60%. I think GPT 3.5 could already do that very well. If you look at sort of more modern models, of course, they do way better than the passing level. So in that sense, they can really pass the US medical licensing exam, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually going to do clinical tasks which they encounter or which you would encounter in clinical reality particularly well. So I will skip this here a bit in the interest of time, but what I wanted to really highlight is sort of a scenario which is a much more realistic scenario, and which we studied a bit in this Nature Medicine paper, is a scenario where not all the information is given to the LLM prior to asking it to give you the diagnosis, but actually the LLM has to also solve the task of gathering the information, generating all the information which is required to make clinical decisions. And moreover, it also has to do this in an efficient way and in a cost-effective way. And it turns out that if you evaluate some of these models in this setting, you end up with quite a lot of problems which you can detect in some of these LLMs. They don't really follow clinical guidelines in many cases, even if you specify the clinical guidelines in the prompt. They cannot interpret laboratory measurements particularly well, especially since a lot of these measurements are specified in terms of numbers, and we all know that LLMs quite often struggle interpreting numbers. And they're, for example, very sensitive to how you encode information in terms of quality, but also in terms of order. So if you, for example, revert the order of information, your LLM might give you a different output. So all of this sort of means that there's still quite a lot of work to be done to actually build models which are really can solve specific tasks. One of the things which we sort of tried out a bit is sort of to go away from just LLMs and to go towards um, vision language models. And I wanted to show you one example of such a vision language model, which specifically solves not a radiology task, but a task in ophthalmology. So that's where you want to diagnose diseases of the eye from OCT images. And so in a vision language model, the typical approach, what you have is you effectively have a model which can take as input both text, but also images. And you can then interact with the model using text queries, and you also get text outputs from the model. I think you have already seen pretty much how you can build such a model in what Akshay was showing you earlier on. We use a very similar approach where we effectively have an encoder which basically encodes your visual information in the same way you encode your text information. And then you, for example, have an adapter which aligns these two representations. Now, of course, one of the key questions is how do you actually build or how do you sort of fine tune such a model? Because you have seen on the previous slide that these generic models are not particularly well suited for this task. So what we have opted here for doing this is to automate this approach of how we generate our text queries or our text question and answer pairs for these images. So we have a large pool of images from which we have automatically extracted lots of biomarkers, lots of measurements, and they have all been sort of quality controlled by a clinical reading center. And so all of that information effectively is present in form of tabular data or tabular entries for each of these images. And what we can now do is we can use another LLM to basically take these tabular data sets and generate question and answer pairs in an automated fashion for these images. So that's the sort of first stage for fine-tuning this model. The second stage, what we then do is we also get a number of images which are very carefully annotated by clinical experts, but it's only a small set of images. Actually, in our case, we only use 330 images for which we have really very fine detailed, fine granular annotations from ophthalmologists. And again, from these very fine-grained reports, we then generate automatically question and answer pairs. Now, once you've done this, you can use these models in a very versatile fashion, right? You can, for example, ask these models, show me what biomarkers or abnormalities are present in an image. And you can, of course, also query whether there are, for example, in this particular case, it should describe the OCT image or write a referral letter when you specify the criteria for a referral. So that's quite important. For example, in the UK, many patients first, when they have an eye exam, they go not to an eye doctor, they go not to an ophthalmologist, but actually there the screening is performed at effectively in drugstores, and then they are referred to experts if they detect some complications. Now, this if you don't do this referral efficiently, you're referred far too many patients to the specialist, and that creates a huge amount of workload. So with these type of systems, you can actually try to actually automate the referral process, and also, which of course is also a very important aspect, you can also, I think, get some form of explainability by linking, for example, the text which you get as an output to, for example, conventional ways of making deep learning models more interpretable by, for example, linking how specific bits of the text in your answer from the language model are visually interpreted, for example, in these type of plots. And I think in the feedback which we got from our ophthalmologists is that they appreciate this type of link very much, because you can actually interpret what the model sees in this type of visualization. Now, with that, I think I want to come to the conclusion, because I think I've shown you many different applications of how we can use multimodal data to try to improve our interpretation of imaging data. And I think that's a very important aspect, that we actually get away from just focusing on imaging on its own. You have a lot of other information in typical clinical settings, and interpreting that information, whether it's in text, whether it's in tabular information, I think is incredibly important. So I want to just close with this particular model, which I think many of you have seen, which of course enables you to generate images from text. You can use it for quite a lot of useful applications, also for less useful applications. You also see perhaps that there are lots of problems still to be solved. It's very easy to see that these models, for example, have a strong bias, as you can see in this particular image. One of the things which I don't know is whether, for example, the male bias comes from the fact that the prompt includes clinicians sitting there, or whether it comes from the specification that they all sit in a pub. So you can perhaps imagine that the bias might come from different parts of the sentence. But still, I think it's quite nice we can generate this type of visualizations. And I want to stop here and just thank many of the funders who have given us money for the research which I've shown you here today. But in particular, I wanted to thank all the PhD students and postdocs in our group, because they have done most of the work which I've shown you here today. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
That was an extremely insightful talk, I have to say. We are a little short on time, so we'll do only one quick question, and then we'll move on to the next. So, dear audience, no? Okay.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So you mentioned ECG, and that is the front line, one of the first